So welcome back to the Tale of Two Frogs. My vintage Tamiya frogs, one undergoing restoration, the other undergoing a resto mod, and where they currently stand. Now, in the previous episode, I kind of gave you guys a little bit of an overview of what I'm planning to do with these cars, with frog number one here. Essentially going to become a slightly more reliable version of the 80s rendition of the Tamiya frog, whereas frog number two will be getting a lot more modifications to it to see what modern technology and what a lot of the techniques out there can get for the car. And I'm going to go over a lot of what I've been evaluating here. So right now, I actually haven't spent any additional money on these cars yet. I've essentially just torn them down to a degree to evaluate where they are in more detail. And I will tell you right now, a lot of crap is coming out and a lot of stuff is going to get thrown out. All stuff not going to get used in the cars. Oh yeah, plus some wheels and tires. So realistically, most of this came off of frog number two because my intention is to do a more extensive modification of it and update to it as it goes. But I'm also going to be using a lot of the good parts between the two cars, picking the best of them to make the better one run. Now, for instance, oh boy, magnets, heat. When we were showing the cars in the previous episode, I commented how frog number two, the motor looked like crap, but that doesn't necessarily indicate performance. Well, the motor that was in frog number one shows some obvious signs that it has been tampered with, and it feels like crap. The really nasty looking motor that was in the second frog, much better condition as far as running is concerned. Also, all the electronics have come out of frog number two. A pair of crappy old servos, Tamiya speed control, rusted out, hardware, beat up old tires. All that stuff is coming out. This is all going to go into the trash along with the original bodies. But for today, we're mostly going to cover frog number one and a lot of what I've been evaluating on here and the things that you can most likely come across and what it'll take to get an old frog up and running. So, like I said, today we're going to cover the issues that I found with this car. Next episode, we'll cover the resolution for a lot of those issues. Now, for this frog project, I need to address the big bugaboo that is the Tamiya mechanical speed control. Mainly because I don't think these things are safe by modern standards. Honestly, they were probably unsafe back in the 80s, but we were too stupid to realize it and we didn't have any better options. But this is going to come out after one or two runs just for testing and comparison purposes. So these speed controls, nostalgia be damned, do not run these things. And I'll show you why in a second, because it's all part of how the electronics package worked. So of course, this speed controller is driven by a servo off your receiver, and you did not have a battery eliminator circuit yet, so your receiver has a separate battery from the motor battery. I'm just using this little 300 milliamp for testing purposes because I'm waiting on a bigger one for later. And startup sequence on these was critical. If you get this wrong, you can have some really big problems. Like for instance, I'm not going to connect that there, but say you have your speed control, it gets bumped and it's in a powered state, and you plug your motor battery in first, the car's just going to go. There's nothing stopping it. So of course this is why a lot of your sequencing has been defined for so long. Turn your radio on first, then your receiver, everything will center, hopefully. Now, had a little bit of a jiggle there, but watching this, so speed control, of course, there's not very great control to it. You basically have off, medium speed, medium high, and high speed. It's really just a 3-speed control. Or if you go in the other direction, you have reverse. And so after you have everything powered on, then you can connect your battery to your motor. Now at this point, your motor is totally live, and you bump this thing, it's going to go. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I'll hold this here to show one of the other issues is that when you have this thing connected, you go a little bit, and then you don't have a slow speed control. It just goes. There's a couple different levels of going, but it just goes. And one of the bigger issues that you had back in the 80s was as your radio battery dies sometimes, more often than not, the range wasn't as great on these radios. And as your radio got out of range while you were driving, it wouldn't reset the servo. Your car would just go. I mean, realistically, runaways were super common back in the era. You could get a battery eliminator circuit to run your receiver off of your motor battery. The problem that you had there was also as your voltages wound down in your batteries, which didn't take very long with the batteries at the time, your radio would lose signal while your speed control was at speed. So again, runaway car. So yeah, we're not going to be keeping this for very long. And the other thing I'm finding too is that radios are not what I remember them to be. There's just the fine control isn't there for this. And I'm probably going to be replacing the radio again after one or two goes at it, just because even a cheap modern radio, you have dual rate, a lot of other things that you can do. Here it's just go or not go. There's really, you do have rate sometimes, but not always. Depends on the model you have. Like this one has rate for steering, but not for the throttle. The higher end models had throttle rate. But anyway, back to what I was talking about. The other issue with these speed controls is that they're very hard to keep in tune. Like if you see here, there's a lot of slop in there. So if you watch, as I go forward, it overruns. It doesn't quite reset the same every time. Or if I go reverse, it doesn't swing as far. But watch not just this slop here, which you can kind of see a little bit as that arm moves. Watch right there as I fully engage this. The whole servo pack moves. So yeah, this is going to come out. This is going to get replaced. Basically everything's going to get replaced. The only thing I'm really waiting on before I do those tests to show you is you have no idea how hard it is to find a 1200 milliamp nickel cadmium or nickel metal battery. So I do have a 1200 nickel metal on the way just to give those comparisons. But yeah, frog number one, after one or two runs, this is coming out. And frog number two, I've already ripped it out. It's already in the trash. Now I expected to find a lot of issues in the gearbox, but actually it was in very good shape on the inside, very clean, well lubricated. I did take it apart, re-cleaned it, re-lubricated, but nothing of any note in there to worry about. The issue is actually in the drive shafts. Yeah, these things the rubber boots are rock solid, 40 years old. Yeah, so that's what we got to look at for replacement here. Also, being that it is original frog, it still has bushings in here. For the short term, I am going to leave them in there just to evaluate how things were with the bushings compared to ball bearings. But yeah, that's where my issue is. It's in the dog bones. So we'll take care of those, clean it up, get it running. So the other thing I'm going to cover before I move on to the next chapter here is going to be the shocks, because this is, of course, the main thing that kind of functions on the rear suspension. The front suspension, there's just not much to it, so I'm not going to go over that on this episode. Of all the 4 shocks that we have between both frogs, this is the only one that was actually assembled correctly per the instructions. So these two up here, and I forget which frog they came from, it really doesn't matter. Anyway, completely dry of oil. The spring is in the wrong side of, well, everything. Was missing the screw that seals up the top seal. Was missing the nut on the bottom that goes onto the shaft. So yeah, these were terrible. The pair off the other frog, though, were actually in really good shape. So one of them was missing the spring that goes on top of the seal. Other than that, they were actually complete and assembled correctly. They look in really good shape. Like, for instance, here is your piston up there, and it's got that disc on there. The purpose of that disc is that when it compresses, the disc flexes out of the way to allow faster movement. So it doesn't really do much dampening on the compression. It's mostly on the rebound, which is because you have so stinking much spring on these things. That is just way too much. Interestingly enough, when Tamiya re-released the frog, they did go with a lighter rate spring, and they completely changed the top seal assembly on there. So I can't speak to the re-release versions, but the original frogs, these shocks are part of the reason you have that reputation for such bouncy driving, is because it really does not dampen the movement in the rear suspension at all. And of course, just to show you what the other difference was here, as I take the top off, you're going to see a spring up on top that kind of holds that seal down properly. Kind of adds a little more compression, sponginess to it. I forget what exact term I'm supposed to use there. So, and like I said, these two, like I said, were full of oil. which I found surprising, and I kind of wish they hadn't been, because I think it might have been gear oil, because it was very thick and it smelled very bad. I would not have expected such a thick oil inside the shocks. So like I said, it might have been just typical gear oil. Now you do have an option. It's very rare that people seem to use it, but you have this collar here, and if you remove the collar, it softens the spring rate a little bit, which I will be doing when I reassemble these, but most people don't know that that's an option. And in all of these, they were, the collar was in place, which further stiffened up the springs unnecessarily. So yeah, that's the shocks there, and then I will take the best parts from these four, assemble up a pair, put them on frog number 1. For frog number 2, we'll do something completely different. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't explain at least briefly what I did do with frog number 2. I haven't really done much work to it other than strip it down. So obviously the tires are no good. The rims that came with the rear tires, I don't know what they're from. They look like they're probably Tamiya something based on the five screw sort of hub design, but they're mediocre at best. I will not be using them. The servos may actually be functional. I believe they might be. I can test them later, but I have some other plans for the guts on these. I'll be replacing with a better servo for the steering purposes. Of course, the steering rods and the rod for the speed control, they're all bent and useless. The receiver, I don't have an Airtronics transmitter. The antenna's cut. This is just trash at this point. I believe I've sufficiently covered the Tamiya speed control system. And the motor, as I mentioned earlier, it's not in great shape. It's obviously been tampered with, so the motor is going to go bye-bye, which leaves me with a mostly empty chassis set. Now, the gearbox I haven't gone through yet. The drive shafts suffer from the same thing that I explained earlier, so I'll take care of those when I get around to it. The front suspension, I haven't done anything with yet. I will in the future, but for now, I'm basically just going to give it a cleaning. I do have some really cool things I want to do with the front suspension that are not very expensive, so you'll get a kick out of that stuff. So frog number 2, like I said, it's just a bare chassis at this point. Cleaned up a little bit, but yeah, we'll be seeing more on this one next episode.